What's up, everybody? I'm Logan Moody. This is the Contrarian YouTube channel. Today I'll be talking about the immensely bullish case for uranium producers and why nuclear is the energy of the future. Today I'll be talking about the current energy crisis that the Western world is going through, what brought us here, why renewables cannot fix this issue, and why nuclear is the only solution for future powering humanity. It has the potential to improve the lives of billions of people, get us onto a permanent, more sustainable path of an industrialized world, and basically it is the energy of the future. If we want to continue to improve the standard of living for people, this has to be nuclear. And I'll lay out the path for this, why this is the case. I'll preface this by saying I'm a civil engineer. I've actually looked a lot into this. I've done a few talks in the past actually based on energy, so I do feel pretty qualified to talk about this. Not saying that I'm the most qualified person to be talking about this, I'm definitely not, but ironically I probably know more about this than a lot of people in the Western governments right now, unfortunately. So first off, right off the bat, where are we right now as a Western world? Well, the US isn't in a terrible situation, but Europe is in a disaster zone when it comes to energy and just the ability to get energy at all. It's a disaster right now. So Europe, electricity prices have gone up anywhere from 5 to 10 times just in the last 6 months to a year. Oil and gas have gone similarly parabolic recently. Obviously, this as a result of Europe being dependent on Russia for so much of their oil and gas, and then shooting themselves in the foot because it was really ultimately Europe's decision to sanction Russia to cut off their own supply of oil and gas. So it really is almost Europe's complete lack of understanding of the need to have their own energy that has caused this issue. It's also a bit of renewables playing into this as well. I'll get into that later. But Europe is in a much worse position than the United States. It's kind of at a breaking point almost. There's certain countries where it's practically at a breaking point at a societal level. So we'll really have to see where it goes this winter, especially when things start getting cold. People's emotions and their loyalties can shift very quickly when all of a sudden they're unable to stay warm in their houses and they're running out of basic necessities for living. So we will have to see where this goes during the winter for Europe. I really do hope that they can come through it and that they can move in a positive direction, that their governments can really wake up to the fact that they need to move back to nuclear. They need to deregulate all the oil and gas that they've practically shut down at this point in their own countries. All that being said, that is where we are right now. Now, what brought us to this point? Well, it was a very gradual shift going away from, first of all, the old nuclear plants that France and Germany, Italy all had built in the latter half of the 20th century. They've been shutting these nukes down pretty consistently the last couple of decades in favor of renewables like solar wind, especially Germany. They've wanted to get off of their older nuclear plants and get on to renewables. Now, why is this the case? I don't know. A lot of it probably has to do with the sort of dirty image that older generation nuclear has with it, and frankly the idea that solar and wind are somehow greener than nuclear is not the case, but that is the consensus, what has been the consensus, and so that has been what the policymakers in Europe have been doing, unfortunately, is getting rid of this dependable base load, this base power supply that nuclear was providing for them for quite some time, and in fact it was providing it at a very affordable rate. So getting rid of these old nuclear reactors is a very, very bad decision that European nations made, and in the last 10 years it's finally catching up with them. Renewables, solar and wind, they're a great idea. They have a great image. You can paint a great image in the minds of your citizens, saying that, oh, we're powering 60% of our grid with renewables right now, Germany. But the fact is that when the sun goes down, when the wind isn't blowing, all of a sudden you have to start up all of these backup, usually gas-fired power plants to back up the grid, because of course people want to be able to watch their television, keep their houses warm, things like that. when the sun isn't shining. But all of a sudden, if you're relying on 60% of renewables for your grid, in theory, all of a sudden you have to have another 60% of your supply in backup mode too. And it's actually immensely inefficient to have this process going, because starting up and then shutting down these backup power plants is not efficient. It's not using them in an efficient manner. You're losing energy for a long span of time on both ends of that process in terms of starting up a gas plant and then shutting it down. So it's a very inefficient process. Storing the energy is a very expensive and also inefficient process, very energy intense as well, to just frankly produce all of these unnecessary steps in the power supply that does not need to be there. You could simply just have, your nuclear reactors, maybe some gas-fired plants as well, maybe some renewables as well. Quite frankly, you could have a decent amount of renewables. You cannot go to all of it being renewables, though, and expect that to work out well. So that has unfortunately been why the West has been facing this increasingly greater energy crisis. Obviously for Europe, it's coming to a breaking point right now with how much they've sanctioned themselves, sanctioned Russia, and basically shut down their own industry. German industry is going almost extinct right now. It's almost impossible to economically keep your business open with the energy input costs that are going through the roof right now. So fundamentally, nuclear supplies what renewables cannot give, and that is a dependable base level of power supply. You need a dependable base load that can give you the needed power when things like renewables start going and fluctuating, when the sun is going down, the wind isn't blowing as much. You need a dependable base load that can step in and give that power. So nuclear is giving that, and the reason why I'm so optimistic on nuclear is I do think that this is eventually going to be something that needs to happen. If people want to keep their standards of living, they will go to nuclear. There really isn't another option, in my opinion. Having looked at renewables, all the other renewables out there, with the exception of hydro, which quite frankly is already almost completely tapped out. There's only a certain number of rivers you can dam up, but all the other renewables, wind, solar, biomass, which is not green, it's just still burning hydrocarbons, but wind and solar in particular are not dependable. They're anything but dependable, and so there will be an inevitable pivot back to nuclear. I think it's just a matter of time, and if anything, that matter of time is getting pushed sooner and sooner, because it could be the case where things really begin to get very bad as energy prices continue to go up, as inflation continues to eat through people's earnings and their savings like never before. It could be a very quick pivot going back to nuclear. So either you pivot back to nuclear, or you have a return back to the dark ages. Frankly, that is kind of what people are facing. I've been surprised, honestly, that there's still the support in Europe behind the whole ESG movement, even with how bad things are getting. I'm simply surprised with how much loyalty there has been to all of that, still with things getting as bad as they have been, but I don't think that can keep going on. It cannot keep going on. So this does lead to an eventual turning back to nuclear. Now, why nuclear? Well, it's cheap. You can produce energy very cheaply. It's abundant. You could keep reusing all of this uranium, potentially even thorium later on. I'll get into all of these different technologies, but it's very cheap. It's very abundant. It can actually be very, very safe. And I'll dig deeper into these newer technologies that are coming up, basically next generation nuclear reactor technologies that alleviate practically all of these old problems of safety, of large areas around the reactors needing to be just empty space in case something went wrong, anything like that, or the need to frankly even store spent fuel in very expensive facilities. All of these problems actually can be alleviated with these next generation technologies that are coming up, which utilize the basic concept but alleviate all of these existential problems that nuclear had, and that these old nuclear power plants actually continue to have. Now, old generation nuclear reactors, they're all basically the same light water reactor technology. These have the fundamental issue of they actually were not designed initially for use in power plants. They were actually designed initially, light water reactors were designed initially for use in nuclear powered submarines. So if you think about it, it doesn't, it's not very concerning to have a very high pressure reactor if you're already under, a mile of ocean above you. You're already basically containing the high pressure within a submarine. So suddenly taking that high pressure water reactor, bringing it to the surface and scaling it up quite a bit for a light water reactor, which is what all the old nuclear reactors have been, you suddenly have the potential for things to go wrong. Fundamentally, you're dealing with a high pressure system. So, a high pressure water reactor, basically you're heating water inside of a pressurized vessel, probably around in the range of 700 to 800 degrees Fahrenheit. So at that temperature, your pressure of your water is going to be, hundreds of atmospheric pressures. And so any tiny rupture in that self-containing loop is going to spell disaster. And so that's where a lot of your issues of Fukushima or Chernobyl or 3 Mile Island have come about, is just minute problems that have surfaced in the very complex mechanism that was the old light water reactor design. So because of that, you had to have these very large radiuses surrounding the reactor itself in case anything blew up. You had to have a very large reactor structure, which made it very expensive. And because of that and all these concerns, you had government regulations stepping in like never before, making it fundamentally just very economically almost impossible to build nuclear reactors at a certain point. But the good news is a lot of these problems have been almost completely eliminated by the new reactor designs out there, of which there are a few, but they all alleviate the problem of either pressurization or the need to store the spent fuel in very expensive facilities. In particular, the pressurization problem has been solved usually by using another substance other than water as a means of heat exchange. So instead of using water, there's designs out there that use a molten salt as the means of cooling your reactor. So you can go from having a very high pressure reactor to suddenly having a reactor that's optimized to operate at atmospheric pressure, because if you have a molten salt, that thing isn't turning into a gas until way beyond any temperature that you're operating at. So you've alleviated the problem of pressurization all of a sudden. And so let's say your reactor heats up way beyond something that it needs to be at. You could design it to where a component of that reactor just melts off and then your molten salt pools down into a containment pool underneath it. And in fact, a lot of the designs out there do utilize this property. There's also designs out there in which you're essentially using just a stack of pebbleized fuel. So roughly a billiard ball sized fuel. It's actually containing the uranium itself inside of the ball. And so as years go on, your older balls move down towards the bottom of the column and are brought out, and usually they can actually be just reprocessed, enriched again with newer uranium. And so in that process, you're having very little waste coming out of the reactor itself. Whereas unlike these old, light water reactors where you had to shut the entire thing down and redo all of the fuel, and the old fuel had to go into a very expensive and very hard to build facility that was containing it for tens of thousands of years. All of a sudden you can have a system of reactors that actually continue to reuse the old spent fuel. They reprocess the fuel, and then you have almost a system that's just a continuous fuel cycle. So you go from a very dysfunctional system of light water reactors, very dangerous system, potential for things to go terribly wrong if they do melt down, to a system where, not much can go wrong, chemically speaking. Usually the new reactor designs I've seen actually don't need any sort of human input to shut things down if things go wrong. They actually can kind of chemically moderate their own temperature range that the fuel reaches. Some of the best designs out there that I've seen actually do utilize this property in terms of when you chemically exceed a certain temperature, let's say it's 800 degrees Fahrenheit, all of a sudden the ability to slow down the fast neutrons to slower neutrons, which is what is needed for a nuclear reaction, all of a sudden that goes down significantly, and vice versa, your temperature can drop. So it's almost a self-moderating reactor at that point. So needless to say, a lot of this could be a little over the top in terms of information, but very optimistic about the public's acceptance of this new technology, especially when things get very, a crisis point for people out there in terms of being unable to afford energy anymore. I think the whole idea of nuclear being unsafe is going to go out the window, because all of a sudden people will be, choosing between heating their house versus, living in caves again, quite literally, or just, burning their own floorboards for heating in a fireplace that they just welded together in someone's shop, kind of thing. So it will be an eventual pivot back to nuclear power. This poses a great upside for uranium and uranium producers, because as Western nations have shifted off of their old light water reactors, the producers for uranium have suffered losses. The price of uranium has gone down significantly in the last decade or 8 years or so. So overall interest in terms of mining uranium has gone way down. As a result, the supply of uranium has gone way down just because it hasn't needed to be there. But when there's suddenly this pivot back to nuclear power, back to uranium, that definitely will elevate the price. It'll bring the price back up to wherever it needs to be in order for people to step in and begin mining it again. So that just spells a great opportunity, in my opinion, for uranium producers. Nuclear is ultimately the energy of the future. It quite frankly has to be what will be powering the future. So there's a lot of other exciting developments within the nuclear power area. There's obviously the idea of using thorium-based fuel instead of uranium. Thorium is actually a lot more plentiful than uranium. It can be potentially even reprocessed more than uranium, so you could, in theory, have even less waste using a thorium-based reactor than a uranium-based reactor. There's also the idea of nuclear fusion itself, which there's a lot of companies kind of in this, in what seems to be a never-ending race towards fusion. They're always saying that fusion's only 5-10 years out. I don't know when they're finally, or if they are going to actually reach a commercially functioning nuclear fusion reactor. Likewise with thorium, I don't know if the status quo of uranium-based nuclear reactors can shift to thorium. It might be able to, and I would definitely welcome that. That would be a great thing. But all that being said, when the pivot does happen back to nuclear, I expect that in the first few years you actually could see a pivot back towards building more light water reactors, and then finally transitioning to building these newer designs I just mentioned. These newer next-gen reactor designs are all, probably going to be built in the next 5 years or so. That is at least the timeline that I've seen on a few companies out there. But I don't know that it's going to be the kind of shift that could happen as quickly as it needs to. So in the first few years, you could see a shift back towards just reopening as many of these older light water reactors as you could do safely, and maybe even building some new light water reactors prior to getting to this new, much more exciting, much more economically feasible nuclear technology. So all this being said, let me know what you guys think about all this down in the comment section below. Nuclear power, am I crazy, or is it the only way to power human civilization going forward? Let me know what you guys think down in the comment section below. If you like this video, just consider subscribing to this channel, and I hope to see you all again at some point.